often frightened without it. We can't touch it. And some animals avoid it. What is it? Light. Light. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us what the parents said when their baby boy was born, because it was a very sad thing. Now, we don't know how soon they realised this, but their baby boy was born blind. He would never see the light. And as he grew up, it was really for certain and for sure their son couldn't see. When other children ran about and played, he couldn't run about and play. There were so many things that he would have to sit there and just maybe amuse himself with other things, but it was very hard. And of course, he could never learn to do something that he could do when he got older in order to earn money to work. If he wanted to be a potter, he made plates and jugs, as many people did in those days. He could never learn that. Maybe he would like to have been a fisherman. He could never learn that. And of course, there was many people who learned to make things out of wood and become carpenters. He could never learn that. Maybe if he'd like to do some work in an office of the day, couldn't do that. The only thing that he would be able to do when he grew up was sit and beg, hoping that some people passing by would throw in their coins. And so, when he grew up, that's what he did. He was blind and he was a beggar. And he didn't notice a group of men walking up towards him, of course, because he couldn't see as they walked near him. And it was a special day. A day probably that he liked, because people were going up on the Sabbath day to the temple. And he was sitting there. Maybe he got more money on the Sabbath day, or hoped he would, as people would be passing by and throw in a coin and think of him. Oh, people were used to seeing him there. But the men who were coming towards him were none other than the Lord Jesus and his disciples. Whenever the disciples saw the man sitting there, they knew the man had been born blind, and they asked a question. They asked this question, and they said, "Who sinned? Was it this man, or was it his parents? After all, he's born blind." And Jesus replied, "It's not because of the man's sin, and it's not because of the sin of his parents either. This man has been born blind that God will be glorified." And then he said, "I am the light of the world." Now, everyone, of course, is not born blind. But the Bible tells us that everyone, apart from one person, the Lord Jesus, is born with a sinful heart. In a way, it's like blindness. It's like darkness inside of us, because we don't understand that we need God's forgiveness. And because that we don't understand that, we don't understand that our biggest problem is sin. And so often whenever things go wrong, we blame it on all sorts of things. But that's why we can be unkind. It's sin that makes us want to go our own way. It's sin that makes us not want to go to church and to listen to what God has to say about us. It's sin that makes us argue and fight in our families. It's sin that makes us pretend when we're asked to do something and we pretend we haven't heard it. It's sin that makes us cheeky. It's sin that makes us do vandal things, like write over walls and write over things. But they're just signs that all of us have a problem called sin. But when Jesus came near to the man, he stopped and he did a very unusual thing, a very strange thing. In fact, Jesus spat on the ground where the soil was, and he began to mix the soil with his spittle, and he mixed it until it became clay. Like just the way you mix sometimes, maybe you mix up and make a dough or something, but this was out of soil and his spittle. And then he got the clay and he began to spread it on top of the man's eyes. And the man could feel this. He could feel it as it went over his eye sockets and spread, and it was becoming cooler as it sat there. And then Jesus spoke to the man and he said, "Go and wash in the pool of Siloam." Now, I don't know whether someone led the man or maybe he went using a stick to feel his way along the road as he was used to doing, or we don't know if someone had to lead him. We don't know all that, but we do know he did get to the pool of Siloam. He got down to the bottom of the hill, and when the man got there, he knelt down. Do you remember what he had been told to do? To wash. And he washed his eyes. He washed the clay from his eyes, and as he was washing, the clay was away. He could see the water. He could see his fingers. When he looked up, when he looked around him, he could see the blue sky. He could see the dark green trees. When he looked down, he could see his own feet. He was cured of his blindness. How absolutely wonderful. And when the man left, he walked home. He was able now to walk straight and clear and look round him. And his neighbours looked and they saw him coming. One of them said, Isn't that the blind man who sat and begged?" "Yes, it's him," someone answered. Another said, Is it really him? It looks like him, but he looks different." Well, he would have looked different, because now his eyes were bright and shining, and before they were dark and he couldn't see. So I'm sure it made his face look a bit different when his eyes were full of light. He wasn't shuffling along the way he would as well, going along slowly. He was different. So the man said, "It's me. You're not mistaken. I'm the man who was born blind. It is me." So what do you think they said next? They said, How are you able to see?" And he said, "Well, it's very simple, really. This is what happened." And this is what he said. "A man called Jesus made clay and he put it in my eyes, and he told me to go to wash in the pool of Siloam." And then he said three things, and I think they're really, really good to remember. He said, "I went, I washed, I saw." I went, I washed, I saw. Now, I was hoping today that we could say that together. So if you're listening today, I'm going to say that 3 times, and I want you to join in with me. And it's a really good way to remember this story of Jesus healing the man after putting the clay in his eyes, the man who was born blind. So I want you to say it with me. I went, I washed, I saw. And again, I went, I washed, I saw. And the last time, I went, I washed, I saw. How wonderful. How wonderful this news was. What a change in this man's life. Oh, wonderful news. His parents would want to have a celebration. Maybe they would have a special party and invite the neighbours and the friends to meet Jesus, the man who had healed their son. Oh, I can imagine this would soon come into their heads, but that's not what happened. No. The church leaders who hated Jesus, they wanted to kill Jesus. They had said, if anyone says that Jesus is from God, they will be thrown out, put out of the synagogue. And that was very, very worrying for a Jew, because these were the leaders, these were the church leaders, and if they said they couldn't come along to church, they would feel that they were in a very bad way before God. Their parents knew Jesus had healed their son. They knew Jesus was wonderful. He had done something that no human being had ever done. And therefore they knew that he was a very, very special person. But they were afraid. Oh dear. It's awful to be afraid. And you know, it's very easy to be afraid. Maybe I'm talking to you and you're a Christian. You love the Lord Jesus. And like many other Christians, when other people around say things about the Bible, or say things about God, or they do wrong things and you know they're wrong and you don't really want to pretend, you want to pretend that you don't really mind them doing it, you don't say anything. We need to ask God every day to help us not to be afraid when others are saying things against Jesus and things about his commandments and things about his word. And that's not all. The Pharisees, the church leaders, the people who should have been pointing the people to God's Son, the Lord Jesus, they were so angry. They were so angry when the blind man spoke to them, but when they began to ask him questions, their eyes were flashing with anger and their fists were clenched, white and angry they were. They spoke roughly and they spoke rudely to the man. They said, "You're just a common man. How would you know? How would you know about these things? We follow Moses. We follow his law." And they began to push the man, perhaps. It doesn't tell us they pushed him, but they put him out. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" And the man was thrown out. He wasn't allowed to go back into the temple. He wasn't allowed to go back in there because of these leaders. But, oh, who is that talking to the man? Who do you see talking to the man? Can you guess? It's the Lord Jesus. Jesus came to him and he spoke to the man and he said, "Do you believe on the Son of God?" And the man said, "Who is he, Lord?" And Jesus said, "I am he that is talking to you." And something even more wonderful happened to the man. Yes, more wonderful than getting his sight back. Just there he understood that Jesus was God's Son, that he was the light of the world, and he came into that man's life and he took away the sin and the darkness inside him. And that's what he does for everyone who comes to him and says, "I believe that you are the one who can take away my sin and the darkness and the wrong things in my life." This man had a new life. This new life that would want to obey and follow Jesus from that day forwards. Very soon, the Lord Jesus would be arrested. He would be tried. He would be nailed to a cross where he would die. And he was taking the place for all those sinful people, all those whose lives are full of the darkness of sin. Sinful men and women, sinful boys and sinful girls. He was dying for those who would come to him and say, "I'm a sinner. I need Jesus to save me." That's the best news. That's the best thing that can happen to anyone. Let me ask you today, have you come to the Lord Jesus? Have you asked him to take away your sin and the darkness? Jesus is the light of the world. But the worst thing is to be like the religious Pharisees. The Pharisees who said, I'm a good person. They closed their minds and their hearts to Jesus, the light of the world. So their lives were lives of darkness. They would face a life of darkness, and they would face even a darker death.